Welcome back to the Deepfake Dialogues. Today I'm speaking with Professor Rupal Patel, a speech scientist at Northeastern University, who spent more than 2 decades working on the human voice. She pioneered a technology that gives personalized synthetic voices to people who can't speak. Let's dive right in. Hi, Professor Patel. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I wanted to start with your background and what led you to working on the human voice.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today, Ashmita. I'm a trained as a speech language pathologist, and I have an undergraduate degree in neuroscience. And then when I was doing my PhD, I got really interested in how we could use voice as basically a way to uh, operate devices when people can't necessarily speak very clearly. So I was trying to develop almost like a mouse that was utilized by changing one's voice pitch as well as the duration of a voice, even though they couldn't speak clearly. So I've been interested in the voice and speech for years. I guess that's why I pursued the speech language pathology master's degree, and then my PhD is also in speech acoustics. And so I've been fascinated with the voice and how important it is and the signal it carries and all of that, as not only for communication, but also for identity for many years.
Yeah, awesome. So you founded a company a decade ago that's since been acquired. So what was the original mission and why did you start it?
Yeah, so VocaliD was a company I started in 2014. 2015 is really when I left my university position to pursue it full time. And it was a research project initially in my lab where we were trying to develop a way for individuals who have to use devices to talk. So think about someone like Stephen Hawking or a child who has autism spectrum disorder or different kinds of, or cerebral palsy, where they can't use their natural voice and because it's not clear enough for people to understand. So they end up having to use devices where they make sounds, or they may actually be able to point to different kinds of messages or spell out their messages, and then a synthetic voice speaks on their behalf. So they input their messages in whatever way is possible. So sometimes people are unable to actually point to the device and they have to use a head pointer. So it's actually it's those individuals who have such severe communication disorders that they have to have an alternative or an augmentative method of communication. So it's called AAC. And these are called voice output communication aids that people use. And even despite the fact that they kind of are entering their messages in whatever way they can, the voice that comes out is typically a synthetic voice, because that way you could say anything you want to say. And it's not sort of pre-recorded utterances. So in our lab, we were essentially trying to figure out a way that we could make a unique sounding synthetic voice for each individual who had to use this device. Because at that time, this work started way back in 2002. And at that time, the kinds of voices that were available on these kinds of devices were relatively like a handful of voices. So there would be a voice that was Deck Talk or Digital Equipment Corporation had a series of synthetic voices, and the names of those voices were Breathy Betty or Perfect Paul, or just a handful of devices. So regardless of who you were, you got one of these voices. And most times, actually, regardless of whether you were a boy or a girl, most clinicians would put the adult male voice, the Perfect Paul voice, on the client's device. The reason for it is that some studies done in the 1970s and 80s that showed that adult male voices were better to understand in reverberant environments such as classrooms and places that are kind of more institutional, right? And so everyone had an adult male voice, typically, which was kind of jarring. And so what we were trying to do in my lab was figure out whether we could make these unique sounding voices, partly because my research had shown that people who can't speak clearly can still make some sound, and that sound carries information about their identity. So what we wanted to do was somehow make the voice sound closer to their unique identity. So that's kind of where that project started. Started as a lab study, and then it kind of evolved into the company because I had an opportunity to talk about the research behind this work at TED Women in 2013. And at the end of my talk, I asked, would you be willing to volunteer your voice? And much to my surprise, many people, put their hand up to volunteer their voice. And within a few months, we had thousands of people willing to volunteer their voice. And so that was the spark to say, okay, if there are that many people willing to contribute their voice, maybe we can do more than what we were doing just in the lab, which was for, maybe 10 or 15 people that we could make voices for. So that's what sparked the commercialization of the technology.
Yeah, very cool. So I do want to go back for a second to who loses their voice or never has one, because I know that it can happen to people, it can happen to children, it can happen to adults and older people who've had an illness. So can you expand on that?
Of course, yeah. So children born with conditions such as cerebral palsy, typically also nonverbal individuals in the autism spectrum disorder. There's a variety of different congenital diseases or conditions. So conditions that people are born with where their muscles of the speech production articulation structures are impaired enough that they have to use a device to communicate. So these are some of the conditions, but there's so many of them. The most common ones are cerebral palsy and autism spectrum disorder and Friedreich's ataxia and a few other kinds of disorders like that. And in these cases, mostly, not only is the speech impaired, but also the ability to use an arm or some other pointing device is also somewhat compromised. So there's been some kind of damage during or at the time of birth that does not allow this person to move their body in the same way as you and I can, including their speech muscles and things like their tongue, their lips, and so on. So that's the congenital side. So people born with different disorders, they still make sound. So it's not that they can't speak clearly enough for you and I to understand, but they make sounds, and those sounds are what their familiar communication partners usually can figure out what their intentions are, but it's not sufficient to communicate with the rest of the world. On the acquired side, there are conditions like head and neck cancer, even stroke in some cases, tongue cancer. I mean, there's a variety of different reasons for why you may lose, or ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. These are conditions where the muscles and the neural input to the muscles of speech and of speech production are impaired, either because the structure is impaired, like in head and neck cancer. So the larynx is taken out in head and neck cancer, or the tongue is removed, and that will impair their ability to speak. Or in the case of ALS or stroke, what's happening is the control is not good enough to produce, or even Parkinson's disease, for example, it's not clear enough to produce clear speech anymore. The muscle strength is not the same as it used to be, muscle strength or tone or all of that.
Yeah. So back when you started working on this, so how did speech synthesis work? And was it different for people who lost their voice like later in life, who'd already had like recorded audio of themselves versus people who have never spoken?
So using recorded audio, sort of back when I started this, the problem with using recorded audio in that world of speech synthesis was, so if you go back to, like, speech synthesis has had a long history in science and technology in terms of how we build synthetic voices. So initially it was very much more a model-based synthesis, which didn't sound very human-like. So you were kind of creating models of the articulators basically from the vocal folds up. And that was like kind of crude sounding speech. And even before that, there were devices that were made in like the 1700s, like the euphonia system, which were barrows and like different kinds of pipes that they used to kind of recreate speech. So humans have been interested in recreating speech by machines for centuries, right? So now let's speed forward to the 1900s, right? A predominant method of creating speech or recreating speech was something called concatenative speech synthesis. concatenation means the gluing together of speech segments. And in the, I would say, 70s, 80s, concatenation became really a way to make these synthesizers because computing became cheaper and you could store all these different kinds of little bits of speech. So people would record hours of speech. In fact, at that time, it was probably like 40, 50 hours of speech. And those recordings then would be sliced up into little segments that had 2 or 3 sound segments together. A sound segment is called a phoneme. So when you add 2 or 3 neighboring sounds together, it's called a triphone. And so typically we would record a bunch of speech, then chop it up into little triphones. Now the triphones are, because every speech sound changes based on the neighboring speech sounds that's next to it. So if I'm saying the word stop, the s sound in stop is different than the s sound in something like please, because it's in please it's in the middle and in stop it's at the beginning and so on, and the neighboring sounds kind of affect it. So that's why we have to create all these triphones. And then the speech synthesis systems that are concatenative essentially have this bank of triphones or diphones, like that would be just 2 phonemes together. And then when you want to produce something novel, you essentially have to break down the sounds that you want to produce and look for and search for, can you find the segments that you have in the triphones and the diphones that are similar to the ones you're looking for? And then you add them together, you glue them together. And that's the concatenation part. And typically where the unnaturalness comes in terms of concatenative speech is at the glue points, at the join points. And so the algorithms to create some concatenative speech synthesis did several things. One, they searched for the right segments to glue together. And then they searched for, because there might be multiple elements that are viable for those segments that to be glued together. So then you also try to reduce the cost of the join points, meaning you want the join points to be as smooth as possible, because things like the pitch and how you set it in the initial recordings might affect the join points. So that was concatenative synthesis. Very high, well, not very high quality, but better quality speech than we had in model synthesis. But the join points, if you didn't have enough speech, you would have like these weird, jumps in the audio, and it just wouldn't sound very natural. In fact, you probably kind of hear some of these concatenative speech synthesizers still if you go to a parking garage and you hear, the message at the end where you please insert your ticket to the right? Like that sounds super robotic. That's likely concatenative speech synthesis. Then in the 80s and 90s, there was a movement toward things like HMMs. So HMMs are hidden Markov models to make sort of a better way to create a more reliable way to create synthetic speech that was more natural sounding. And then deep neural methods, deep neural networks, and then more eventually now we've got these tachytron-based methods that are more neural-based speech synthesis. So neural-based speech synthesis that we have today requires much less speech, because what we do is we train on a larger database of speech. We train the neural model to understand how to speak generally in a language, okay? Let's say in the English language. And then when I want it to sound like me or you, I take a little bit of speech from you and I adapt my universal model in English, let's say, to sound more like me. That's why I need less speech, but you still need a lot of speech to kind of start it, right? And now that we have the ability to record so much audio, and audio is sort of around us all, we're recording, an hour-long audio sample right now. So all of this speech kind of helps us make those sounds, make the voices sound better. So over time, several things have happened. The quality of the speech synthesis has become so much more realistic because of the methodologies we're using, and the amount of speech we need from the individual that we want it to sound like has decreased. And so that's a huge change. So when I was starting VocaliD, in fact, we typically needed about 7 to 8 hours of speech. And over the course of the 8 years that I ran VocaliD, we decreased the amount of speech we needed year by year by year because of the change in the technology, the underlying technologies, the methodologies we were using to make the synthetic voices. Toward the end, I think we were using somewhere around a half an hour or so because we really wanted it to sound like that person. And I'll explain to you how we did that in a second. But these days, I think the newer technologies is 4 years later is like, you get about 30 seconds of audio and you're pretty good. It's still not a really great replica of you, but it's close. So this is what's really fascinating about speech synthesis technology these days.
Yeah, it's very interesting to hear the evolution of the technology over time. And I do want to get to the implications of how easy it is now to kind of clone a voice and synthesize speech, because I know that it's a dual use technology. But I do want to start by focusing on the use cases that you've built up, which are extremely positive. Can you talk more about the actual process of, say, someone comes to you wanting their speech to be synthesized, like someone who's completely lost their speech? Is that different for different types of conditions? And yeah, how does that work?
Yeah, sure. Let me explain a couple different things. So someone who has lost their speech, so they have recordings of their audio, or they're able to record their audio before, let's say, the surgery to remove their voice box or something. In those cases, we ask the individual to record a certain set of utterances, and those utterances have different sounds and sound combinations in them. And so that way, when we try to replicate their speech, we've got, some good samples in there. And like I said, now you need less and less of that. So that's really great. So in that case, you then take those recordings and then you build a speech synthesizer around. It's relatively simple. You take their recordings and you make the synthesizer that sounds like them. In the case of someone who was unable to speak from birth, but still has the ability to make sounds, and those sounds carry something about their identity, in those cases, that's really what started VocaliD. That's what we discovered in the lab, is that if we take a little sample of that person's voice and we do something called inverse filtering, so we remove the parts of that person's sound that is unclear and hard to understand. And we only maintain the parts, or as much as we can, of the identity bearing cues of that person, like what gives them their voice, what gives them their identity. And then we find somebody else who's similar to them in age and gender and accent and, whatever. Not that many people with speech impairments have an accent really, but we find the kind of the ideal person that they want to sound somewhat like in terms of clarity. So then we have that person do the recordings, the longer set of recordings, because they can produce clear speech. They're their voice donor. And then we inverse filter their voice as well, removing that person, the donor's identity cues, but only keeping their clarity cues. And then we recombine digitally the identity cues of the recipient who's going to get the voice and the clarity cues of the donor. And when we recombine them, now we've got a set of recordings that sound like the recipient, but are as clear as the donor. And then from those morphed recordings, we build a speech synthesizer. So now the speech synthesizer sounds like the person who's going to use it, but it is clear. So essentially, we're kind of grafting the donor's voice onto the recipient's voice, right? And that's how and then we build the speech synthesizer from those grafted recordings.
Yeah. And so how does voice donation work, and how do you find the right pair and like the right match?
Yeah, so when we were doing this in VocaliD, we had this big initiative called the Human Voice Bank Initiative, and that there was about 100,000 or more people that volunteered their voice over the course of the years that we were running the initiative. And again, that was basically a web-based interface where we had some stories and some sentences for people to read aloud. So they read things like, depending on their age, they read either children's stories or, articles or whatever their interest was. And we would provide them the content to read, and they would be set up in a quiet room, and we would sort of instruct them to what to do. So they would have a screen that would have a sentence at a time. They would record those sentences, and as they're done each sentence, press the next button and move on. So that's how they banked their voice, right? And that's how donors were contributing their voice. And they were doing that from all over the world. So we had people from 110 countries, people of all ages from like 6 to 91. It was really cool because when we create a donor recipient match, we needed people that were similar in age. Because if I want to sound like a 9-year-old, I can't combine my voice, with a 9-year-old's voice and make it sound the same. So you needed kind of, depending on who we were making the voice for, we needed donors of every age. We needed donors of different accents and so on. In VocaliD, we focused mostly on English, but we had lots of different accents and we had people from around the world. So that's kind of what they did. When someone was losing their voice, they did the same thing, but they were their own donor. They would go onto the Human Voice Bank website, and they would do the same thing. They would record those sentences, and they had the choice to select which kinds of content they wanted to read aloud. But same process. They would record their utterances, and we could use those recordings then to make their synthetic voice.
Yeah, awesome. So were there any, I'm imagining, were there any reasons why someone would be hesitant to donate their voice, and how did you alleviate that?
Yeah, I mean, so for example, there were many people who were very interested in wanting to donate their voice, for someone who couldn't speak, right? And that was kind of how we started the Voice Bank initiative. And we also had sometimes people that were sort of kind of in the middle of that process. We had people that were voiceover artists who were very interested in donating their voice to someone who needed it because they knew how to use the technology. They could make great recordings and all that. But then they were concerned that their recordings might end up being used to replicate their voice, inadvertently or something like that. And in those cases, we would assure them that that we had some protections of how to do that and so on. And that's not what our goal was and so on. And in some cases, people still said, well, those are not enough, and I want to contribute, but I can't be sure that, my voice is not going to be used in some other way. And so they would plan not to do it. When we started working, so, our genesis at the beginning was all this sort of working with individuals who couldn't speak. But as our company evolved over time, we also were hired by other companies to create voices for their products. So it would be maybe a voice for an telephony application or a voice for some kind of a product or something like that. In those cases, voiceover talent were hired to make the recordings, and then we would use, and that we actually had a separate platform for the Human Voice Bank and then our commercial entities, because those recordings needed to be kept kind of very differently because they had different kinds of rights and obligations that we had to protect, because they were only going to be used for certain kinds of use cases and they couldn't be used for the human donation pieces of it. So so there was a lot of sort of evolution of even our processes as we moved from only serving individuals who couldn't speak to also creating, commercial applications or enterprise applications.
So were there any cases where your technology wouldn't work for that person or couldn't sufficiently synthesize that person's speech? Were there any conditions where that was the case?
Well, I mean, I think doesn't work is a little bit subjective in this case because there were certainly many cases at the very beginning where people purchased a voice and for their child. In particular, I'm talking about that group where there's more dissatisfaction, let's say, because at the very beginning, the synthesis didn't sound as good. And this idea of cloning or making a voice with the combination of your voice sample and a voice donor sample, it was completely new and novel, right? Nobody had done that before and so on. And people's expectations of what they're going to hear of the voice versus what the technology can do kind of differed. And there were many people, we were making a custom voice per individual, right? So this is a very high labor cost, and it extremely challenging to do because we had to, we're also using volunteer voices, so people aren't recording in the best environments and things like that. So like it was probably we bit off a little bit more than we could chew initially. It got better over time, but there was definitely people that were, not satisfied, and they would say, well, that voice doesn't sound like my child, or that voice, my child's voice is much more assertive, or it doesn't have the right accent, or this or that. So, many times we would recreate a voice, we would have to redo it, we would have to try again, and in some cases, even then, it's really hard because voice is very personal and it's very subjective, and so what one hears in the voice is very subjective, right? So we did our best. There's probably still people feel that, in the initial ones weren't as good as they could have been. And the technology now is so much better. So if we had, 10 years forward technology, our voices would sound a lot more realistic, but we were working with what we can then, which was different than the technology we have today. So yeah, lots of learnings and lots of I wouldn't call it, yeah, pain, actually. Pain and dissatisfaction at times as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you touched on like the reactions of the family, because I did want to get to that. Like, are there any memorable first, like when first reactions when they hear the voice for the first time? I guess it would be more emotional for people who've had their voice for a long time and
Yes.
then have lost it, and
Yes.
are trying to trying to see that it's replicated. Yeah.
Yes. Going back to my comments about people that were unsatisfied, typically the ones that were more unsatisfied were the people whose children hadn't spoken, and now you're creating a voice for them. And so they have like something in their mind of what their child should sound like, there was less of a because there's no anchor in that case, but the places or the group of people that we saw the most satisfaction and almost like we were returning something to them was the people who had lost their voice to diseases like ALS or throat cancer or things like that, where it was just like it gave them a new lease on getting their voice back. And I remember one of our first clients was this gentleman who had ALS, who I absolutely adore and love, and he did not have recordings of his own speech. He had an iPhone that had some recordings on it, but then when they switched over to an iPad, they lost all the recordings, which was just so sad. So we had made a voice for him, and we'd actually made 3 voices. So when we were initially starting, we made several voices with different donor combinations, and we were doing we experimented in more ways because we needed to show that this was the technology was working. And in this case, he heard the first 2 voices, and he was sort of politely, kind of nodding and, whatever. And then he heard the third voice, and he and his wife basically whispered to him, "It sounds like you," and he just had this reaction of his whole body started shaking, and we had tears down his eyes. And it was so emotional also because the early people, we became really we got to know who they were really well. So it was just it was an incredible moment. It was a really, really wonderful moment. Also, on the other side of the congenital impairments, we had one family that was just, one of the first impetuses actually to turn this technology into a product or into a company was the letter I received from a 9-year-old girl whose sister had cerebral palsy. And she had written me, and she apparently watched my TED Talk, and she said, I have a daughter. I have a sister who is unable to speak, and I would love to donate my voice to my sister. It was just she was 9 years old, and I had kids around the same age, and I was just kind of needling my kids and going, my goodness, I needled my son, and I was like, oh my, wow, this kid is able to write letters like this. What can you do? And she really, I think that was for me when I got initial responses like that, where people were just like, how can you, can we do this for my loved one or so and so? And there was also some people that were really upset at me that the technology wasn't available yet. And I was like, I'm just talking about the science. Like, I don't have a company. And they're like, well, then that's false advertising. I'm like, no, I didn't advertise that I had a company. I was just talking about what the science was. So anyways, there was a lot of like emotion around starting VocaliD. I'd been doing this work for 20 years. And when I got all these people that wanted to volunteer their voice, I thought, wow, maybe we could do this for more people than we can do in our lab. And that was what started the company.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. That's very touching. So now I want to get into like, when did you realize that the technology could also be turned around for malicious use? Because it is, at the end of the day, it is like a neutral tool,
Yeah.
like all technology.
Yes. Yeah. I'm glad you kind of framed it that way. That's an interesting way to frame it, as it's a neutral tool, right? It's not like it doesn't inherently have good or bad associated with it, right? It's this it's a tool, and people can use it in whatever way they want. So I would say from 2015 to 2018, the voices sounded good, not great. By 2018, there was a new technology that we were using. It was deep neural network based technology, and the voices sounded categorically better. So let's say if they were 70% understandable, before, now they were more like 85 to 90% intelligible, which is a huge gain. Like, that's massive. So the underlying tech has changed of how you make the synthesis, right? And so it's around that time we were approached by some banks about the fact that they were starting to release my voice as my password, voice authentication systems on the telephone. So when you call the banks these days, they'll ask you whether you can use your voice as your password. And we were approached by them to say, well, hey, if you guys are making these synthetic voices, we know you're making them for, good causes, but could someone else, an adversarial kind of player, take the same technology and create a spoofed voice of an individual, and would it spoof the authentication system? So that was our challenge, and we had a contract to build a bunch of voices with different amounts of audio data, and then see if we could spoof the system. So we did that, and we found that actually, even though to our ear it sounds good, not great, but and also then like a human could tell it's fake, but if the system is a authentication system, it may not be able to. And what we found is that we were able to actually break the authentication system with these synthetic voices that, to the human ear, we would detect that they're synthetic, but the devices didn't, the algorithms did not. That was sort of our first, like, we actually didn't believe that we would be able to do it. and with the voices, because it just didn't seem like the tech was there yet. But that was our first indication of, wow, okay, we are building a technology that could have these negative consequences, unintended consequences. So that's when we started developing what we would call anti-spoofing methods as well in our technology. So we started putting things like it's like a watermark kind of, but it's in audio. It's called steganography. So audio steganography would be like a way to put a signal in there. And it can't be something that is easily removable from the signal. It has to be embedded, but it also shouldn't be destroying the signal of the audio sample when you listen to it, right? So it's a challenging problem. So that's when we developed some new technologies around how to protect the voices from being misused. And that was, we got a few patents in that area. And we started, in fact, for 6 or 8 months, we started sort of thinking that might be an avenue of our company where we would try to, not only have build the voices, but also create a tool that would sense when there's a synthetic voice available, right? And at that point, when we approached some of the banks, they were like, "Well, it's not a high enough risk rate, and so our insurance would cover it, and we're not gonna bother with this technology that you have." And so, we carried on doing what we were doing. That's also when we formed Athos. Athos was is a coalition of our company as well as other synthetic media companies, including Modulate AI, which was another company that was doing voice conversion. Voice conversion is different in that sense that you're still making the voice sound like somebody else, but you have two different people who give you equal audio data sets, and then you kind of convert between the two voices. So different from speech synthesis, because in speech synthesis, you just have like this one speaker that you're trying to make the voice for. You're not kind of converting between those two voices. So, I think 2018 through 2020 is when there's a more of an understanding that the tech is getting much better, and it's important for us to have ethical, responsible kinds of methodologies. That's when different kinds of associations were formed as well to make sure that we had ways to protect synthetic media from being abused. And I think that was mostly done by the small companies, actually, I want to say. The larger companies were not undertaking some of these things. And I don't even know if to this date there is as much of that activity or that sort of responsible AI aspect of it in the big tech companies as much as there has been an interest in the smaller companies. We had more to lose, I guess, when we didn't have major lawyers backing us up. And I think coming from the roots that we had of like doing, social good, we certainly didn't want our technology to be used in nefarious ways.
Yeah. And this is a very interesting discussion because there is a broader debate right now with AI and more broadly the fact that like LLMs can be used for good and for bad. So there's this dual use concept where when it comes to certain domains like cybersecurity and biosecurity, it's either much more sensitive. And then there's this debate where it's very hard to find the right balance between like letting people ask questions who are, out of genuine curiosity, who don't have malicious intentions, versus trying to block bad players. So this is definitely it's a fascinating and very relevant discussion right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you maybe a story is an interesting one here, where we had a gentleman whose wife had recorded her audio before she had, I think it was had neck cancer. So she recorded her audio. It was either that or ALS, I can't remember. And then I don't believe she had actually made her synthetic voice. She just recorded it ahead of time. But then I guess her disease progressed, and then she didn't come back to like get the voice from us or anything like that. But after she passed, her husband had asked us to recreate her voice. Now, we had, at the one, I mean, he's writing this, he's asking to recreate her voice because he just wanted to hear her again. And he had such, compelling reasons for why he wanted to hear the voice. But we had to make sure, triple sure, because we were like, the voice once built, it goes on a device, it goes on an iPhone, right? And people can use it however they want to, right? There were lots of reasons for why we had to like kind of really vet, is this a legit use case? Because you could imagine it could be used for insurance fraud. It could be used for all sorts of reasons that and we don't know these people. Like, you don't know who it is that's asking for this, right? And so even if you want to believe the best in people, you also know that there are bad actors out there, right? And we have no way of controlling that. And we want to do things responsibly. So it's these kinds of conundrums and these kinds of like, I don't know, edge cases, I would call them, really, where the ethics part and the tech part really, rub against each other. And it was, I could think of like 4 or 5 other use cases like that where, there was concern because as the tech kept getting better, like from, as we got better, and now I would say, since speech synthesis sounds like, it's very hard to pick. It's very hard to know if a voice that you're listening to is synthetic or real. I wouldn't say it's completely impossible, but typically I would say I would give it more like a 95% accuracy, like 95% kind of likeness score. Whereas I would have given the stuff that we were doing in the early beginnings, like more like a 70 or 75%. And then by the time we exited, maybe close to 92 or 90% or something like that, right? So this last 10% is really difficult for the human ear to detect between, right? So it becomes even more important to put in safeguards that maybe we didn't need as much when the tech wasn't all that good, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, yeah, and this will continue to be
Yeah,
a super difficult like conversation, like because there is no right answer. It's all about trade-offs here. So
totally,
yeah,
totally. And even the stuff that we were doing, like if you think about the watermarks that we were putting in the audio samples. And then we had another kind of methodology where we were not just putting the watermarks in there, but we had a tool where we could detect with a high level of confidence if two samples were, you know, the same person, or like if there was one was synthetic and one was the human. So, but depending on the technique that's being used to create the synthetic voice, that is a game of whack-a-mole, right? So like, yes, we'd be really good at detecting ones that were made in like, 2015, 16, and we'd be pretty much a chance with the ones that are made today in 2026, right? So that's a whole decade of evolution. And, speech synthesis, I would say in the previous few decades hadn't changed in the same speed. The speed at which this last decade has evolved speech synthesis technology is radical. Like it went from like slowly getting better to like this, So it's fascinating.
yeah, for sure. And yeah, so this is a very insightful conversation. I just want to wrap up by talking about what you're working on right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So when after VocaliD's acquisition, I worked for our acquiring company, Veritone, for a while, and was leading their AI and accessibility division. And then I had taken a long hiatus from my university position. And so I wanted to go back, needed to go back if I wanted to ever go back. So I went back to the university in 2024. And I really wanted to do something a little different than I was doing. It's kind of a way to sort of reinvent a bit. So what I did is I started focusing on a new area of research that I find very compelling and I'm very interested in, which is using basically the inverse. So speech recognition and speech synthesis are the inverse of each other in terms of the technology, right? So speech synthesis is generating the voice, speech recognition is understanding the speech and voice. And so because the tech had gotten so much better and I felt like I wanted to go back to speech recognition, which was one of my earlier loves, I really wanted to use the ability to understand the change in voice over time for different kinds of health conditions. And my focus in this new lab that I've created called the Vox Lab, VOXX for Voice of Women Lab, is looking really at the changes that happen in the voice over lifetime. And in particular in women, our voices don't change so much during puberty. I mean, of course, our voices are different than how we were in kids, as kids' voices, but during the menopausal, perimenopausal period, voice changes quite a bit because of the hormonal changes in our body. And voice change is such a sensitive change, and because it's such a hyper precise kind of instrument of our body, the human voice. And so it actually is a really good indicator of motor changes or neurological changes that show up in voice before they show up in gait. So individuals with Parkinson's disease will have changes in their voice before they'll have changes in walking. And so it's a very good early indicator. Also conditions like ALS, you might be able to detect before the condition gets worse. Many neurological conditions, also many metabolic conditions. For example, in diabetes, type 2 diabetes, a variety of different things, including pulmonary conditions, heart disease, and so on. And interestingly, too, the incidence of these diseases goes up in women during the perimenopausal period because the hormonal changes with estrogen depleting has an impact on arrhythmias, has an impact on volume of air we can take in. There's a whole bunch of things together. So what we're trying to use is voice as a biomarker for different health conditions. So, my interest is really, I'm a speech scientist. I study the voice, and I want to now use it not only to recreate the voice, which I don't think it's a solved problem, but it's more solved than it used to be. But I'm very interested in this area of using voice as this biomarker for different health conditions, and in particularly in men. So in women. So I've also started a center called the Center for Wealth, which is women's health, looking at women's health as well as the impact of ignoring women's health on the economic well-being of women that are in the middle age period.
Very cool. Yeah, I'll be keeping a close eye on that. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a fantastic discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, and is there anywhere where our listeners can learn more about you and your work?
Yeah, they can go to my website at Northeastern University and just search for my name at Northeastern University, and you'll find my lab. You'll also find the research center that we've started, which is an interdisciplinary research center, the Center for Wealth, and also on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deepfake Dialogues. If you found this conversation insightful, please follow and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. See you in the next episode.